The Real Estate Photography Podcast is brought to you by tourbuzz.net, high-definition virtual tour and photograph hosting, now with interactive floor plans. Sign up for your free trial today. Hello and welcome to the Real Estate Photography Podcast with Mike Mariello. This is our interview with Michael James. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
Pretty good. Tell us all about yourself and how you got into real estate and architectural photography and the blog, and, well, I'll just be quiet now.
Sure. Basically, I got into real estate photography as a client first. I was basically buying and selling real estate in Atlanta. So I was buying distressed properties, fixing them up, and then trying to either rent them or sell them. And what ended up happening was I found that the better the photography was, the more eyeballs I got on the property, the more people that wanted to see the property, and I would end up renting or selling the property much faster. And I hired photographers, and I was always frustrated that nobody could really tackle the exposure challenge where there may be a beautiful garden out back, and I wanted somebody to take a picture so they could see the interior through the windows and the garden beyond. And there was several other different scenarios just like that, and no one could really tackle it without blasting flash completely in the interior to the point that it didn't even feel like the lighting inside the property. So ultimately I started grabbing a digital camera and playing around, and I didn't know anything about HDR at that time, but I started taking multiple frames and changing the exposure, and most of the time it was just trying to trick the camera for a split second that it would under or overexpose, and then I would take those layers into Photoshop and I would just basically, not HDR, but I would just start masking in and out areas. So I got to the point that I was doing this so often that other real estate investors who were friends of mine said, Mike, would you shoot my property? Because your stuff is just amazing, and it's one of these things where in that group of investors, it's not as competitive as you would think. So I gladly, for money, started shooting other properties. So I never really had a cutting my teeth phase of trying to find work and whatnot. I already was kind of discovered because I was doing my own work. And then from there, I just got so many requests to start doing photos for other people. And realtors started finding out about me that I basically just became a full-time photographer at that stage and hadn't yet figured out high dynamic range imaging. It wasn't until I moved to the Emerald Coast in 2004 that I really started to experience these huge exposure issues, because all of a sudden now I'm in a property that's on a beach with blinding white quartz sand, sun blasting off of that and bouncing into the property itself. So now all of a sudden I had challenges I never experienced in Atlanta. And it's at that point that I started looking around and bumped into HDR and started playing with it and couldn't really find any great resources online for it. So I just kind of got into Photoshop and Photomatix at that time and just started toying around and playing with the sliders and just kind of had to learn it on my own.
Wow, that sounds like a super wild ride to get from, doing one thing into shifting into what you're doing now and kind of discovering, well, I wouldn't say discovering HDR, but kind of evolving into the HDR field. Was it a smooth transition once? What was the aha moment when you kind of found HDR?
Actually, it was definitely an evolution process, like you said there. It was something that was painful, to be honest, because when I first started, there was no tutorials online, and it's not that there were no tutorials. It's just that most of the tutorials were online were showing you how to create fairly unrealistic and grunge and surreal, and obviously people, when they first discovered HDR, thought it was so cool because all of a sudden you could do things that normally you'd have to be pretty savvy in Photoshop to be able to do some of these dramatic changes. You'd have to know a lot, but all of a sudden Photomatix and a couple of sliders and you were a rock star. It was like you were able to create some pretty wild images. People were putting up shots of cars and bikes and things with reflections that would normally be impossible to capture, and all of a sudden you've got this amazing look. And obviously in the beginning it was something that nobody cared that it didn't look real. It just looked cool, and I didn't need cool. I needed real.
Right.
So my challenge is here I am with Photomatix and playing with the sliders, and the default settings every time I did a merge were pretty much a little challenging in terms of the saturation. And then along comes Photoshop CS2 with the merged HDR, and it has its own challenges because it wasn't exactly user friendly, but yet the images themselves didn't have the oversaturation and some of the other challenges that Photomatix presents, because all these softwares use different algorithms in the merging process and they deal with luminosities differently. So I was slowly getting away from Photomatix, even though after the first 1,000 or 2,000 shots, I got pretty good with Photomatix. I knew where to get the sliders to get it fairly real looking, but it still did something in the merge to HDR process that was oversaturating certain colors in certain areas, and the luminosity issues were just too much. I finally just gave up on Photomatix and stuck with Photoshop CS2 and then into CS3, and then other applications were coming on the market and I started playing with those as well. So it was a real evolution process of just, it was really painful because we're talking about hours and hours and hours of testing. I would test things such as take 9 brackets instead of 3, or I'd pull a bracket out here, push in a bracket there. I mean, I did so many things to find a way to get to something that was fairly realistic. But anytime you're trying to get all of that dynamic range squished down into one 8-bit image, you're going to have some kind of a compromise. And that's pretty much what, I mean, HDR, when you're shooting for photography like this with the real estate, everything's a compromise.
Absolutely, yeah. And I can totally relate with that whole testing one software and then another and then another, and realizing I love this aspect but I absolutely hate this aspect. And I can actually say the same thing about Photomatix. From time to time, it does feel like smoke and mirrors sometimes, where I'm not sure what the result is going to be, and I really like consistency with my stuff. And do you know what I mean?
Well, if you're talking about the challenge with Photomatix, I mean, I do. Even though you can change settings, like you can in Photomatix, I'm sure you're familiar with. You could save a setting, but that doesn't matter because every scene's different.
That's what I mean. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's like, and I think it's also with the saturation thing that you were just saying too. Okay, this is really nerdy, okay, but I use a Mac and I was experimenting with Automator because I was getting sick and tired of doing something one way, and I wanted to try, and just like you were saying, kind of experiment with another method of doing it. So I created my own Automator action, whatever you call it, and it would basically merge the selected photos into Exposure Fusion and make this is really nerdy, like I said, picking the fine-tuning and the adjustments according to this code, and then outputting it so I could do everything with one click, which really, as we all know, does not work. It was really to test to see if I could do it. And I was getting crazy different results using Lightroom versus using this new Automator action, and they were just coming from different sides, but the results were far different with the same exact settings, if that's what I'm trying to say. Same settings, different results.
And that's what I found with the different softwares as well, because I know with getting, first of all, to address the situation of automating, I tried that too. I mean, I absolutely was trying to find a way to come back from a shoot, put all of the bracketed shots into folders, and just have a piece of software. I've tried it with all of them. Go through, merge, and then automatically, with some kind of default settings, spit out some, at least, JPEGs or TIFFs in order for me then to maybe just a final tweak in Photoshop. And it just doesn't work.
It doesn't, yeah.
It just doesn't work.
I have the same experience. It doesn't work. Oh, I'm glad I'm not the only one that's tried this.
No, you can get close, but it just doesn't, you just can't get it I don't care who you are, you just cannot completely automate it, because every scene, as you know, the software may be getting the luminosity values fairly consistent, but that's the challenge because every room obviously has its own feel to it. So that's where you and I have to get in there and actually force it to about what the feel of the room was, not necessarily what a piece of software says. This is the midpoint.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. All right. Well, before we get too far into HDR, because I do want a lot of this interview to be centered around HDR and basically your blog and your workflow and all that nice stuff. But I want to at least first cover your business, and you said how you got into it, but what you didn't say is you're located in, I think on your website you have Florida, Pennsylvania, Georgia. You're located in, well, I should say you do business in these different areas. How does How does that work, and how do you market yourself differently, or what's that look like for you?
Actually, what happened was, and I'll explain why it ends up looking that way on the website, and is because I have places to stay in all those locations with family, and the key is that I had a client here locally that was a builder, is a builder, and he had me shoot a dozen properties of his that are all throughout the Emerald Coast. Turns out that he's actually based out of Atlanta, and he had found my website a couple of years ago, and he had somebody else shoot in Atlanta for him. And I said, well, why didn't you call me? He's like, well, you had it as the Emerald Coast Photography. And I was like, oh my God. I just realized that, I mean, this guy had something like 36 properties to shoot. We're talking about like a 5-figure paycheck that I could have gotten. And just simply because I didn't have Atlanta listed as a potential destination. I mean, technically it should say, United States or, the world, wherever you will fly me. But technically my site now says Atlanta, Philly, and of course, Northwest Florida, because I can and will be in those destinations, in a very short period of time. Atlanta's easy. It's only 5 hours away from me here. And for New Jersey, I do go up quite regularly to visit family, and I usually contact some realtors locally, and my father actually does that for me as well at times. And so basically I'll make a family trip into a semi-family, semi-business trip, so I can go up for, say, 3 weeks and shoot for like a week and a half of it and spend basically 3 weeks up there, but a week and a half of it I'm actually earning income, pays for the entire trip, and then I try and shoot a couple things on the way back down. I don't mind driving. I used to be a road warrior years ago, so I don't mind that it's a massive drive in that direction. But that's the reason my website has Philly, and it has Atlanta, and it has this area. It's not that I have offices there. It's not that I have staff there. It's just me, and that's the reason why it has those. And technically, I mean, this is probably one of those situations where I should have something like, Caribbean or something like that, places I'd like to go to. But for now, I know that I can get to those places very quickly and not have to have the client incur additional costs for lodging.
No, that's phenomenal. And I was gonna, my second, follow up to that original one was about the marketing. What does that look like? It sounds like that is your marketing strategy to say flat out, this is where I have worked. Hire me.
Yeah, and it works. I mean, basically, I had somebody contact me, and they're like, "Well, look, we're in North Carolina, and we see that you're not there, but you're in between there." And so I basically have something booked for mid-May in North Carolina, and of course, I've already put out the word in Atlanta because that's going to be halfway there via car. So I'll end up making a business trip out of it, and so it's already, I guess, from a marketing perspective, starting to work, because somebody who would have never have called me originally saw that I was fairly close, or at least kind of in between two markets, and I'm getting business out of it. So,
all right, I wanted to ask you a couple questions about the HDRI blog. Well, I'll tell you, before I ask questions, you tell us about it.
I started the blog because obviously the topics of high dynamic range imaging interest me because it's pretty much my workflow. It's my life. And I found that I would get emails occasionally from people saying, what kind of equipment's out there? What kind of software's out there? What is HDR? And even though I haven't created basic tutorials, what I've really done is kind of just put out blog posts about different hardware that's out there, different software that's out there. Occasionally I'll talk about a specific technique that I do. They're not necessarily a 1, 2, 3. A couple of times I've put a blog post up there that's a little bit informative, but for the most part, it's been things that surround the industry, where the industry is going, what hardware is coming. So sometimes I'll talk about specific camera manufacturers, and then other times I'll talk about different pieces of software that are out there. And sometimes I'll get emails from people saying, "Oh my God, this is exactly what I was looking for." Like there was one time I posted something about Enfuse. And somebody hadn't even heard of Enfuse, but yet they were using Lightroom, and they went absolutely nuts. And actually, this is a very good point, because what you talked about earlier with software having different results, I have actually experienced the same thing that somebody flagged me about, which is, Enfuse uses some open source pieces of application to talk to. It's actually a plugin for Lightroom, but it's using those open source. And somebody had actually tested the same bracketed images in Lightroom using the Enfuse plugin, and then they actually used just the open source itself outside of Lightroom, and they got completely different results using the same exact images, which leads me to believe that Timothy Ames, or I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but the guy who created that Enfuse plugin, there must be some kind of additional settings that can be changed or tweaked, because when I went in there, I thought there's no way. It's using the same back-end sources. It can't possibly be. And I did. And I actually experienced some better results, like less dirty shadows with using the actual open source software with no GUI. Rather than using Enfuse. So there's times where I know that an image is going to be very challenging because the room was very, very dark, and I won't even attempt to use Lightroom and Enfuse. I'll just go into Lightroom and then export TIFFs and then take it over to the actual, non-GUI, source, and then throw it through there, and I'll get better results. So it's just kind of one of those things where, I just talked about it on the blog, on one blog post, and then I'll get, somebody, giving me feedback saying, wow, that was great. Or, I'll cover on the blog also things about various cameras with auto bracketing, and I could go on and on, but basically HDRI blog is basically it's my little diary of what I'm doing in HDRI and how I am seeing the industry change. At some point, because I've gotten a lot of requests for this, I'll start doing some kind of a video / tutorial / maybe even a workshop, because as you know, this is the kind of stuff where you need to be over someone's shoulder to really learn it.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, here's the thing. For someone walking into HDR, you have to go through that evolutionary process that takes, as you know, a very long time. And sometimes it's a very frustrating, bumpy path. How much better would that be to actually look over, like you said, look over somebody's shoulder and learn, in a half a day what someone learned over the past 3.5 years?
Yeah, the thing about HDRs is that it's very deceiving. It seems like it's so easy because all you have to do is just take the bracketed images, take them into a piece of software, show them where the images are, it does the merge. But the truth is, if you're trying to create photoreal or very close to photoreal as best as you possibly can, that's where all of the challenge is. Because the truth is, it's easy to make kind of crazy, saturated, fun images. It's easy to do that. It's hard to then wrestle with all the different sliders and settings to get it to look real.
Well, that's exactly right. Because the whole principle behind HDR exposure fusion, at least as I see it, is you're basically going to open up this box, which is our camera. It's a box with a hole in it, and you're going to capture all the light and all the shadows, and you're just going to pack it up and go home to your computer, and then you're going to modify that light. And you've captured every, and I mean every single, as much as possible with today's technology, bit of highlight and shadow detail, but you still need to make sense of it, and making sense of it is really the long process, and that's where you have to, be on your A game.
Yeah, I mean, you just nailed it. I mean, that's what it is. You're basically just capturing it. You got your box of light, and then you take it back, and now you've got to cut a piece out, but there's no one little piece in that box that shows the room, and now it's basically crushing all of that box down into like a sheet of paper, and that's the hard part.
Well, that's fantastic that you have the. See, I like the HDRI blog. I actually, well, I should say for our audience, I linked to the HDRI blog way back in the summer, and then I found Michael's work, and I asked him, as a photographer, I asked him to be on this, and then I kind of discovered that he was the man behind HDRI blog, and it all kind of made sense. I'm just glad that you have that blog, because it's really helped it's helped me even put things into perspective, like what camera manufacturers and what camera bodies have what sort of AEB features, and it's really, really nice to see that someone else is doing the work for me.
and just like you're doing these podcasts, like even now, and I know that's a lot of work as well, and I definitely appreciate it, because I've listened to some of the other interviews with other photographers, and it's been great. I mean, I've really enjoyed what I've seen already between your blog and the podcast. When you contacted me, I was like, wow, this is great, and I'm thinking, does he know that? Like, he linked to my blog, and obviously, it's my own fault, because, digitalcoastimage.com is the site that you contacted me through, and I don't have any blog link from my photography site. It's actually a separate blog, so I'm thinking maybe he doesn't realize I'm the same guy. So, It worked out well.
I didn't see it at first, but after you said that in your emails, I was like, it does make sense. Yeah. Um, but no, thank you about the compliment for the podcast. I hope that the audience likes it too.
I would think so. I know it's a lot of work, and I know every time you talk to somebody different, there's just one little thing, even if it's just one little thing or one little angle. Plus, when I'm editing, I don't know about other people, I'm editing photos, so it's not like I can't listen to somebody talking about something complicated because there's no text on screen. It's just images. So I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I definitely have been able to listen to yours. And every now and then I stop and I think about it. I'm like, oh yeah, I never thought about that. Because there's some other guests you talked about that use lighting quite a bit, and I don't. So it's definitely interesting to listen to other people talk about their workflow.
Great. Well, speaking of workflows, that's the next thing I wanted to talk about. I had a series of questions that you have too, and it's all about kind of your philosophy in HDR and kind of your workflow from beginning to end. And what does we'll start at the beginning. What is it about HDR that you prefer over lighting?
Well, for me, it's a necessity because most of the properties here, this wasn't as true in Atlanta, but most of the properties here, the showcase of the property is the view, whether it be a backyard because it's not on the beach or it is the beach. The view through the window is absolutely critical. So many of these properties have been built specifically, whether it's a condo or a home, for the living room, for everything to effectively face the Gulf of Mexico, the beach. So it's not necessarily facing just the HD screen. In many cases, I'm shooting a room that doesn't even have an HD screen. But all the furniture is effectively set up to take advantage of the view. Mm-hmm. So for me, flash is very unrealistic because you have these huge panes of just glass everywhere that act like mirrors. So even if I can get one spot where the flash isn't going to hit directly ahead into a pane of glass, you still have the reflection behind you and above you that's going to be everywhere. And in many of these cases, there's nowhere to hide a light. There's nowhere to stick a light. So, or multiple lights. So it's very challenging. So HDR became a necessity for me. And occasionally I do use flash in certain circumstances, but not when I'm going to do a merged HDR, but when I'm going to use Enfuse, because you can actually, obviously, I'm sure you've done this before, merged HDR images without flash with one or two that has flash, and it does not hurt the image. It actually helps the image.
This is hilarious because I literally on the forum of the podcast, not 10 minutes before we're recording this, I just responded to someone who asked this exact question, and I'm not even kidding you. It's the exact thing you're talking about. They're saying, how does one go about, shooting, adding flash into diffuse exposures or HDR, and yes, yeah, that's exactly right. Well, the thing is, I typed it all up, so you can go read it on there, that whatnot in the forum, but. Yes, you're exactly right. It helps. It adds. It can get rid of some of those shadows. It can fix the competing color casts. It usually does help as long as you don't merge photos with different white balance settings, because it gets very, very. As I said in the forum post, it becomes a headache when you merge things with different white balances.
It does, and the one thing that the flash really helps with is when, especially in my situation, and I just started doing this about a year ago when I really started using Enfuse fairly dramatically in terms of like over merged HDR. I started using Enfuse almost as like the first thing that I would do for a solution. But basically, because you add that one bit of flash, that blazing sun hitting the water and spilling into these windows, even when you capture an HDR, sometimes the dramatic shadows that are cast across the furniture causes so much darkness in the foreground where I'm sitting that detail's being lost, and color is a big problem. So just one or two frames, like let's just say I do an AEB of like say 7, and then after that I'll fire off 1 or 2 flash, and then when I come back in post I might use one of those with the other 7, and all of a sudden that one area that was extremely dark just gets filled ever so subtly and nicely with the flash. And occasionally I might have to do something where I take or do multiple fuses and then go into Photoshop, and because maybe there's a piece of flash showing up in a mirror or what have you. So there is a post workflow outside of the Lightroom Enfuse. But basically the flash that you talked about, I mean, I feel as though it's extremely important. It's gotten to the point now where I rarely am taking shots where I'm directly shooting into a beachfront scene. There's rarely ever a time that I don't take at least 1 or 2 frames with flash that I plan on using in post.
Gotcha. And that was going to be one of my questions about. Well, it was about one of your photos that we're going to look at. I'll save it for then, but hold on to that thought.
Oh, okay. That's fine. I mean, I don't know if you want me to talk about workflow when we look at the photos, or if you'd rather me just talk in general about it now. I don't know what makes sense.
Well, I had one more question about your workflow before we go through them, because I feel like we can talk a lot about HDR as we're looking at the photos, and you can go through this. But I did want to ask one question that I normally don't ask, and it's about, tell us about your gear, because we normally don't talk about gears in terms of, oh, what camera do you use, what lens, because I feel like asking someone what camera and lens they use is like asking them what memory card they use. It really doesn't matter. But for the HDR workflow, depending on what camera model you have, it can obviously dictate how many brackets you can get off with auto exposure bracketing. Obviously, you can manually, bracket off exposures anytime you want. But I'm just asking, what gear for HDR do you use, and do you prefer to use, or do you plan on getting?
Actually, the comment you just made is very, very important to me, which is the auto bracketing is critical to me, and it's critical to have a wide enough one without touching the camera, because if you're using any of these flows, whether it be merged HDR or Enfuse, if you choose the setting, the little checkbox, because there's a checkbox for both Enfuse and other softwares for merged HDR, if you use the checkbox that's going to align the photos, you double to triple the processing time for each time you do the merge or an Enfuse. So for me, I don't want to touch the camera, because I don't want to have the photos aligned.
No, and if you're doing, you're working on 30, 40, 50 photos of a single shoot, depending on how big the house is, well, I'll tell you what, you're adding up hours.
Forget it. Yeah. It's tremendous amount of wasted time. So for me, when I have people say, "Oh, well, I could just flip my Canon over to the C1 setting and then fire off another," that's true, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that for me personally, my choice, because I do this full time and it's very important to me, was to get hardware that allowed it. So I jumped from Canon to Nikon because Nikon has a 9 AEB function, and that allows you to get most of the scenes. But the scenes that I have to capture, many times, the 9 AEB with 1 EV step in between, because that's Nikon's max on their particular line of cameras, is that you can get 9 shots, but the maximum jump in between shots is 1 EV. There are times where I need 11 or 13 for some of these beach scenes, sometimes even 15 with 1 EV steps, believe it or not. It gets crazy. So what I found was, last summer I discovered a piece of kit that's called Promote Control. And it is effectively this little handheld device that connects up to both Canons and Nikons, and they're looking at other manufacturers as we speak. It hooks up via USB and allows you to take control of the camera and do unlimited, whatever the camera's maximum capabilities are for HDR captures. In fact, like a Nikon D40, the original D40, does not have auto bracketing.
You're telling me.
If you connect up via USB, the Promote Control, you now can do, if you wanted to, a 17 AEB capture with anywhere from 1/3 steps in between up to 3 EV steps in between, and it jumps up by 1/3 steps. So it just gives you unlimited capabilities for when you reach scenes where you don't want to touch the camera and you want to get one capture through. And the Promote Control is, I think, $299. And I've done a video tutorial on, I don't know where it's linked on my blog, but it is. I did 2 video walkthroughs that are about 15 minutes. Then I basically show the product. I have no affiliation with the company. This is just one of these things that solved a very important need for me. And there's other pieces of kit out there that do similar things. And I know with like the Canon 5D Mark II, you've got the Magic Lantern firmware update that gives you a 9 AEB for a 5D Mark II.
Okay.
So there's different things that are out there, but for me, it's very important to not touch the camera. So I'm using a Nikon D3, but I also use a Sigma SD14. I also use Canon. I have even a Pentax. I am basically camera, company agnostic. I don't care who's making the best technology at the time. I just want to be able to get all of the captures done in camera without touching the camera, so that when I get back into post, I don't need to worry about the images being merged together. And there's another important issue there, is that when it does that complicated stacking, you will get softness. I don't care how good your software is. You're going to get slight artifacting and softness if some of those images were not aligned perfectly.
No, I've experienced some of that. If there's ever a place that I'm shooting that we're on carpet, even the weight of the camera with the battery grip on the tripod, when it clicks the shutter, it can actually bump it just the tiniest amount if it's on soft carpet with a thick pad on the bottom of the carpet. And yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's very frustrating because there's no way to fix that besides going back and doing it again.
Yeah, but basically for me, it's capture. In terms of gear, that's really the only thing I wanted to cover, because as of right now, it's like the big dog on campus. I mean, it's the other thing that's coming in the future, next summer, or this summer, I should say, is Red. If you go to red.com, they have this camera coming out. It's called Scarlett, and Scarlett is going to have an unlimited HDR capture. You could literally do a 31 or a 51 AEB if you want to.
And how much does the Red cost again? How much?
It's like $27.50 for the camera, and then let's say you want a Nikon mount instead of their mount, it's like $500. And but if you want like a full kit, the Scarlett, a full kit with the LCD, with the battery, with a fixed lens on the front and everything else, it's going to run $47.50. So basically it's less than the cost of a D3, and you get a lens and all the extras that you need for the camera itself. But here's the other thing too, and this is very relevant for guys if you're going to be doing video. The Scarlett, they have announced on their forums, is not only going to do HDR capture for stills, it's going to do HDR capture for video.
Yeah, I read something about that. That's really, really interesting, especially for folks doing video tours.
Bingo.
Yeah, exactly. No, the reason why I asked about the price, I must have been confused with there's another Red.
It's the Red one. It's the original.
One.
It's like $17.5.
That's what okay, that's the price that I was thinking. And when I see prices like that, I say, I'm a married man, and if I want to stay married,
No, that's the reason why everyone's so excited about the Scarlett, because the Scarlett is effectively going to make it cheaper than some of the high-end HD cameras, but basically now you're talking about a camera that shoots stills. I mean, like Esquire magazines shot a bunch of front covers with the Red one, the Scarlett is actually going to be very close to the same resolution. So you're now dealing with a situation where it's taking raw stills, it's going to sync up with flash, it's going to be able to shoot video at a huge, very high frame rate, and it's going to be able to do HDR video. So for one camera, you're going to be able to take stills that are just as good as a D3 and video that is better than current $15,000 Canon and Panasonics. So it's a category killer. The Scarlett is no joke, and it's basically something that I'm probably going to move to when it's finally released, because it was supposed to have already been released, and it's a fairly new company. But when it releases, it's going to change a lot of shooting, and I really truly believe that it's going to be something that anyone that's doing real estate photography and thinking about doing video tours, for one price, you're going to have 2 areas covered completely.
It sounds like a really impressive tool.
Yeah, I mean, I'll cover it on the HDRI blog when it comes out later this summer.
Excellent. Okay, now let's talk about photos. Why don't we go into the photos and let's start doing a walkthrough. We could talk about workflow, you could talk about the story behind the photo, whatever you want, whatever comes to your mind, let's talk about it.
It probably makes more sense to have even done it in this stage, because it'll bring it home.
Right.
So,
all right, let's talk about photo number 1.
This is, one thing I probably should do at some point is show some of the before captures. Mm-hmm. So that you can really put into context how difficult the exposure crushing process was. So, but in this particular one, this is an example of what I discussed with you before. You'll notice straight ahead, I lined it up with the curtain because I did shoot flash in this particular scenario. So I did an exposure with the promote control. This particular setting with the promote control, I did a capture of 15 frames at, I believe it was one EV step in between. I may have done one larger with tighter steps, but that was one capture. And then I also fired off a few different shots with varying flash exposure. I didn't bracket the flash. I just did single shots, and I just fired off just to try and get a feel, because this front area in the photo, to the front left, the front right, and even straight ahead up against the wall itself, the spill, and I'm sure you've experienced this with HDR before, you see that curtain ahead, how it looks like the one that's dead straight ahead that has, it looks like there's a little light wrap coming around the corner of it, just to the left side of it. It was much worse than that. It was bleeding on all the edges of all of the curtains, but the flash photo filled in that light spill that was like basic. I don't know how you describe that, but you know what I'm talking about.
Is exactly what I'm at a loss for words, but obviously I'm saying I know exactly what you're saying. It's, you know, the light intensity is just so much coming into this room, even in I imagine this is a very brightly lit room too, considering all the natural light. I don't know what's behind you, but imagine that, and it still comes through. It's I know how frustrating it can be. But so you're saying you solved that by firing off a couple flashes or a couple of frames with flashes and kind of define those edges so you could fix it in post.
Bingo. Gotcha. And also because the truth is that this room was front loaded. All of the light was coming in from up front. You can see it glaring off the ground a little to the right there, but if you look up top at the ceiling, you'll notice that there's a fairly dramatic reflection that's obviously coming off of either the beach or the patio, that's casting a shadow up top. That's what like the major light source that was coming into the room was. So when I fired off the flash, it filled in some of the shadowed areas throughout the room, the foreground, as well as some of the areas to the left where the photo was. Like that painting over there, even with the HDR, was very difficult to get any of the texture. The realtor that wanted this shot wanted a little bit of that detail back, so the flash saved that. So just to give you like a breakdown, I took those shots, I came back, I happen to use Lightroom, but I use Lightroom, I make my raw adjustments, I make my color balance adjustments, and then I do the Enfuse plugin. So I fuse out 2 TIFFs. I'll generally go out with a few different TIFFs. And now this is probably pretty important because I've seen people talk about how Enfuse tends to blow out windows. And I'll tell you how I get around that. I usually do one where I favor the brackets. So if I took, let's say 15 shots, I'll do from shot 1 to about shot 11. So I'm about 2/3 to 3/4 favoring the darks. Then I'll do another Enfuse where I'm flipping to the other side, where I'll favor the lights and I won't go all the way down and I won't capture all the way where the windows are coming through well. So I have 2 separate fuses there. And then when I have the flash one, I'll do the flash one and I'll add that in as a separate one. So I'll do all 15 plus the flash, maybe even 2 flashes, because if I set them off at different powers. So I'll end up with like 2 or 3 images that I take into Photoshop, and then I don't know how familiar you are with Photoshop, but you can basically do a flip of a mask with the luminosity. So I'll choose one photo. Let's say, for example, I'll choose to have, I have 3 photos in here right now. I have the underexposed, sort of infused. I have the one that was the overexposed. So one's favoring the darks, one's favoring the lights, and then I'll activate the light one. Then I'll go under the channels palette, and then you option click the first one in the channel, which is the RGB, and it gives you the marching ants. That marching ants is for the luminosity. Okay? Then I go back into the other photo. I uncheck the bright photo, and then I check the one that's the darker one, and I just hit the mask. Now, and then flip it. So basically, what I do is I get in a situation where I'm using 2 photos, and I'm using the luminosity of the one to then invert that mask that can bring out the other. So what you end up with is you end up in a situation where in the brighter image, where the windows are a little bit blown out, because Enfuse tends to blow out a little bit, you end up in a situation where you've used a mask to basically say, okay, these are the bright areas, but then you're going and you're using that mask to allow the visibility of the darker parts of that image to come through. So what you end up with is in a very quick click, 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 you end up with two images that you're getting the areas for the windows pulled in a little bit more naturally. So it's kind of getting around the fact that Enfuse doesn't quite nail it with pulling in the windows.
That's a huge amount of information, and I can tell you, I think I see a Michael James guest podcast in our future.
Man, as I'm talking about this, I'm like, there's no way anyone's going to follow this Photoshop really well.
No, it was complicated. I'm going through it. I admit I was lost. Probably about 3/4 of the way through. I mostly followed it, but I really, really need a visual step-by-step on this.
I know. See, you can also take a middle exposure and then just desaturate it and then just basically use it like a mask in Photoshop. So all of a sudden now you've got like the middle exposure. It's got half the darks, half the whites, and you can use that as a mask. And then there's like a couple other clicks where you can go like Option Alt Shift 2, and that selects the top 50% of the luminosity, gives you marching ants, and now you can flip that. So for me, I have never been able to get Enfuse to give me a perfect image in just one shot. It happens. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, about 15% of the time, just using Enfuse alone, I only need Photoshop for final tweaks, and it's it. But 85% of the time, I'm just not quite happy with the way the luminosity is, and I'll end up doing this two-pronged approach.
Well, what's amazing is, let's take a step back for a second. What's amazing is software is developed for us, for HDR, in a sense where they think, well, we want to take lots of exposures to make one clean image. But now, the process you've just described is that it's not doing everything we want. We want basically the software to process all 15 images a certain way, and then let's make another one and process it a different way. So now we need our software to merge both of those brand new merges into one clean one.
Oh, no, I've done that before. I'm glad you just said that because I've actually done that before. I've done a fairly dark merge. So let's just bring up that 15 images example. I might take image 1 through image 10 and do a merge using Enfuse, save it as a TIFF. Then I'll take image 15 down to image like 6. So now that's favoring the highlights because I shoot underexposed to overexposed. So when I say 1 to 15, it literally is the first shot is an underexposed. It's not the middle exposure. I know some people like to have middle exposure as first shot.
I think that's the default on Nikon.
It is default.
I'm not sure what the default is on Canon, but I know it's it's default on Nikon.
Most of them, that is the default. Takes the middle exposure first, then comes through. I generally force the camera to go from under to over because of the way I do workflow in post. So when I say I take image 1 through 10 of the 15, that's the dark one. I Enfuse it out. It's a TIFF. Then I do image 6 to 15, Enfuse it out. It's another one. Now I've got two images that are Enfused, right? And now I'll reopen Lightroom and pull those two in and Enfuse those two. And many times when I've done that, it ends up pulling in the windows a little bit better because what happens is now you have two images that don't have this dramatic differences in luminosities, and the software is pulling them both together. So if you're not good with Photoshop, and this is why I'm glad you brought that up, that is actually another solution that I've found to be quite effective.
That's I hadn't thought about that. That's a really neat one.
And you might think, well, that doesn't make any sense because it's the same 15 images. But no, actually, technically, the software is doing complicated algorithms, and it's looking at luminosity values. So if you've done this where you have a slightly darker one that you've Enfused and then a slightly lighter one that you've Enfused, you've crushed huge dynamic range down into a single image. So now the software is taking those two images and it doesn't have to crush as much luminosity into the same range, and it just works. I mean, I hope at least the fact that you brought that up and I just said that, someone will say, forget all that Photoshop stuff he was talking about. That works better.
Yeah. Well, I always say I always think it's a really good idea to know your way around Photoshop. I think it's an incredible resource, and if here's the thing. We use Photomatix and Infuse and all these different niche programs to do these fusing of exposures in HDR. But I really think the fundamental is knowing how to get your way around Photoshop. Because what happens when I don't know? They always what happens when you don't have access to that program, or you should know the basics.
Yeah, and I can tell you right now that for the future, if you're a photographer just listening to this and you're thinking about getting into the space, with the way video is becoming so dominant and broadband usage in the United States is increased so dramatically that it's in so many households, people are watching more video. YouTube is making it more accessible, Vimeo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've just this year started to get agents asking for video, whereas the prior 3 years, nothing. So I would say that if you're interested, I would take a serious thought to download the trials and to think about, I know this is going to kind of rock your world in terms of, I don't know about that, but I would actually lean towards After Effects instead of like a Photoshop if you've never learned either program, because After Effects works in 32-bit also. It is made for compositing. So the way that it deals with masks, the way that it deals with painting and whatnot is much more effective in terms of a faster workflow. And if you did learn After Effects instead of Photoshop, when you lean into the video side of it, you're already in a program that deals with and works with video natively.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, and I'm not even going to talk about this, but I actually use a few higher-end programs like Apple's Shake, which was used for like Lord of the Rings, et cetera, et cetera. And I also use on the PC Fusion 5. I know it's at version 6 now, but that was worked on Sin City, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason is because I'm sure you've worked in Photoshop with masks where you're like not quite happy with the mask, and now you got to pull out the brush and just move it a little bit, or you like select the current mask and you try and feather and you fight back and forth. Well, in the compositing applications, it's a totally different world. When you create a mask, you have sliders that basically say things like feather amount, and edge, so you have all these little sliders that with a quick flip of a wrist, it's creating a feathered edge for the entire luminosity of the mask. So things that would take 5 to 10 minutes in Photoshop, I can do in about 8 to 9 seconds in either After Effects or another application for compositing. And you can do the compositing applications you can use for working on stills or video. But it's a whole nother ball game.
All right. Well, let's talk about photo number 2. I don't want to rush anything, but I don't want to. We are running out of time a little bit, so let's go on to photo number 2.
That's okay, because the truth is I've covered the bulk of the workflow on that first one. That was the heavy lifting.
Okay.
It's funny that you chose this one. I know I sent you a separate link. This one's not actually on my website for a reason. And it's not because you wouldn't know this, but the colors are way off.
Okay.
And I'm also glad that you chose this one for that reason, because this is one of those where I should have fired off a flash more powerfully. I did fire one off very, very lightly, but what ended up happening is the builder that I shot for wanted a lot of detail out. And the images came back, when I got back, they were just a little too dark, and the window spill, the light that was coming in was so extreme that this one's what I would consider overcooked. It's too HDR to put up on my website itself. Okay. There's nothing wrong with it, I guess, because the builder's like, oh, it's cool. I like it. It looks like an architectural rendering. It's fine for my portfolio. But if I gave this to a realtor, they would be like, Mike, you've got to be kidding me. This doesn't even look real. It looks fake. Like there's no way a client's going to want to see that. And those cabinets in the distance are not the kind of yellow-orange they look. They're actually like this almost grayish blue.
Oh, really?
The lighting is so off here. In fact, the stove, the overhead, is white.
Okay.
I blew this one so bad, I can't even begin to tell you. But I took an alternate angle that had the colors correct. The builder did not ask for this specific angle, so when I took it, I didn't spend a lot of time on it. I just ramped it up in post. In fact, this one I didn't infuse. It was so underexposed, and it was such a difficult capture, and I didn't fire off a flash that made it work for me in Infuse. I basically did a merge to HDR and then ramped this thing up in an HDR program because, I missed it. I blew it. You know, we all make mistakes. Even though I've done 13,000 HDRs and merged and tone mapped, I still make mistakes from time to time, and this was one of them.
How dare you make mistakes, Michael?
It happens. You know, it's just, you know how hard this stuff is. I mean,
Hey,
people
yeah.
don't know how hard this is until you try to make it look real. I mean, just merging and bracketing and getting in there, people are like, I don't understand what the big deal is. But when you try and get it to look like it did when you were there, and you've got daylight mixed with tungsten, you don't realize this is actually a lot harder than it looks.
Hey, I know exactly what you're saying, and at first when you were going through this and you were saying that you blew it, I was like, oh no, I feel so bad for picking this image, but then I was thinking, well, you know what? It's really good that that we come out and we say, look, we made a mistake, and fortunately there was another shot to offset this one, but I know it's a
No,
good
no,
thing to hear.
actually, the reason, then this is where I was going to make another comment too. You didn't interrupt me at all, but the other comment I was going to make is that because I didn't fire off another shot with flash, it didn't give me the chance to get the color balance right. And this was the reason why when I saw this, I was like, oh, this is actually a really good one for him to have chosen, because I blew it so bad, and I'm going to give somebody a tip that's probably going to change someone's workflow completely. And what I forgot to do on this shot, because I was in a rush, and because there was a designer that was in the house staging other rooms.
Hmm.
So I forgot to take a shot that I normally take. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but I will turn the flash down. I will then, meaning like to point directly into the room, not up at the ceiling.
Right.
And I will either have a diffuser over it, meaning like, a LumaQuest type diffuser that's a
Like a
piece of
little
plastic,
bare bulb extension.
something like that, or just use the flash itself that has the little thing you extend out so it goes wide.
Yeah.
And I literally blast the room with one shot with flash. Sometimes I do it two because it doesn't come out quite right. And you may be thinking, why are you doing that? And the reason is because when you do that, you overpower all the tungsten and you overpower all the other lights, and the only light source you have is flash. So then in post, if I'm having challenges with color, I will bring into Photoshop that one image where I blasted the flash. I will put it over top of everything. You go down into the drop down right there in the layers palette, and you not normal, not overlay, blah, 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 you choose color.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, all the luminosity is of the other images, and the only thing that it changes in the image now is color.
That's a super useful tip.
So all of a sudden, the cabinets, which you had really bad color challenges with, will just pop with the color that they actually are from the flash.
That's really, really neat. I had never thought about doing that ever.
I've been doing that almost since day one, because the first thing that frustrated me to no end was that when you shoot HDR, you've got this dramatic difference of tungsten lighting, color. The Kelvin of these light sources are all different. So for me, I finally decided, you know what? What if I just used the color blend mode in Photoshop, and it doesn't pull up any of the luminosity. It doesn't care what the lumens values are. All it cares about is the color values. Now, every now and then, it does things like it would ruin the color of the windows. Well, you just click the mask button and then
Right.
paint black over it. So now it doesn't mess with the color that's coming in there. Or if there's only one problem spot in the entire image, you can just have that color layer be the area that you paint in the correct color of the counters or the ground, etc. I didn't do it for this image. That's why when you chose this one, I thought, oh, this is a perfect opportunity to talk about a little, I wouldn't say it's like a super secret tip, but it's just something that I figured out on my own very early on. And it's
No,
been
thank you for
tremendous.
sharing. That's a great tip to share.
And you know what it's good for? Anytime you've had an image where you've got this wicked cyan blue spilling across countertops, and it's like coming from the daylight source, and you're like, ugh, I can't get rid of it. What I just described is how you get rid of it.
That's great. All right, let's move to number 3. It's a really, really neat looking bathroom.
Yeah, this one's actually from a recent shoot, and I let the client choose the angle. I actually liked a different angle completely. They wanted this one. They got it. They
No,
write the check.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they write the check. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's just that the other angle that I chose was a little bit more geared to the left so that you had that space, and it pulled in another sink to the left of the bathroom, and it just caught the right edge of the tub and caught the right edge of the shower. And it just, because you're using a wide angle lens, it really helped with the distortion. So it didn't look like that vanity is, it looks 1,000 miles away because we're at 14 millimeters here.
Oh, yeah.
What ended up happening was, as I angled it, the left-hand side was much more naturally proportioned. You had the sink come in, and then on the right-hand side, it just made the shower look a little bit bigger, and the vanity all of a sudden became a little bit more natural sized. And what became the center frame that looked like a mile away was the door. So the other angle was actually a better angle. This is the one the client wanted. This was a 7 bracketed image, no flash. I actually was just luckily behind the mirror in the distance. I'm just behind that towel.
Oh, yeah.
I've had to Photoshop out when I've been in situations where the only good shot is when you're going to be in a mirror, and then you have to Photoshop it out. I've done that before. Luckily, this one, because of where they wanted this thing situated, I was able to get it behind the towel, didn't have to Photoshop it out at all. But it was 7 shots, and here's another thing I do. That in this particular case, the lighting in the shower was so light. I mean, it was dark back there. So I brought in a $10 light. One of those little itty-bitty lights that you would use for painting. It's not even on a stand.
It's a work light.
Yeah, and it's just a tungsten work light because, it's tungsten in the room. So I use this tungsten work light, and I had an extension cord across the ground, and I stuck it down on the ground in the shower, and I flipped the light on. So I took a separate bracket of 7 shots. So when I infused 2 images out, when I brought it into Photoshop as a final image, I just masked in the one area of that particular shower area, so you could see things in there, such as the towels in the distance in the shower area. It was so dark, it was literally just black.
Oh.
Even with the HDR, the original one was black because there was no light back there.
I was going to say, they didn't have any lights back there. Not at all.
There's just the overhead that you see up top there on the ceiling, but it really did not light because that light source, that whatever that glass is, tempered, whatever that light is filtered with, it was so dark back there. Obviously, for privacy reasons, I would expect, but it was so dark that you couldn't see any detail beyond that. So I just lit that one area up and masked it in Photoshop.
Hey, makes sense to me.
It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Okay. Last photo. This is kind of a bonus photo. I wanted to kind of look at the pool shot that you had. I just think it's a really, really interesting thing because let me just say first off, I don't think a lot of people know how difficult it is to shoot a pool, and it seems like a very, very straightforward exercise. Aim and shoot. But you got to be really careful. I'm just saying before you start talking, whatever, be really careful. You can't look down, you can't look up, you just got to look straight, but you got to check out your height, you got to check out your lighting. Can you see through the water? There are so many different things that enter when we talk about pools, and I thought that you had done a fantastic job with this, that I thought, hey, he's got to tell the story behind this pool.
Basically, I had to bump up ISO tremendously, and thank God this was shot right after, not too long after I'd gotten a D3, which can handle high ISO. And the reason is because obviously your shutter speeds become so long when it gets dark that the water, even though it's blurred here, when I originally tried it at like an ISO 400, everything was blurred. You couldn't even see detail or reflections off of. I know this image is very small, and I think I sent you a separate one that was a little bit bigger. I'm not sure if it'll show up or not. The one I'm looking at right here is pretty small. But when I bumped up the ISO and was able to get the shutter speeds up a little bit higher, I was able to get at least the water that was spilling off of that front right unit. A little bit of it came up in glare. When I originally was shooting at 400 ISO, it was just becoming one just blur of water. I know in the actual pool itself it's blurred because obviously an HDR image, you're going to blur multiple frames together.
Right.
And you can't just choose one in most cases because it doesn't have the correct luminance values. Because I've tried that before with pool shots, by the way. I've tried to, at night, take in just one image, and in the areas where the water is hitting, like coming down from a source, I've tried to mask in, and occasionally you get lucky, so it looks as if it wasn't a long exposure. but you have to take it at a high ISO in order to pull this off. The nice thing is when you're dealing with water, a lot of times the noise doesn't show up as badly if you're shooting with a high ISO, so you can keep that shutter speed up nice and high. But this particular image was a 9-shot bracket, which may seem extreme for a night scene, but the truth is because you had such dramatically dark shadows, and if you shot at night, you know that those tungsten lights are really bright. It's almost like you're shooting in daylight with the sun's in frame and you've got shadows in frame too. It's really a tough capture. And this was back in the Photomatix days, so this was quite saturated.
It has a tendency.
And by the way, this was for a builder, and he had seen some other images that I had done, which were done with Photomatix. He's like, "Oh man, I love the look. I love the feel. It has a certain energy to it." It was like he was like all into the whole artistic side of it. So he basically gave me free reign to just not have to worry about trying to get it as photoreal. But this was 9 images bracketed, and this was Photomatix completely.
I liked it. From what it sounds like you would do it differently if you were to do it today. Is that safe to say?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The only thing I would change, though, it's not that I actually like this photo, even though it's kind of overly saturated. The thing I would do differently is I would just the post-processing with Enfuse. I would do it differently. In fact, what I would try and do is the areas where the water is hitting and there's luminance down there, I would probably, let's say there were 9 shots taken, I would probably take the middle range, like shots, instead of doing all of 1 to 9, I would do 1 to 9, Enfuse it out, but then I would do a separate one with, like, let's say 4, 5, and 6 only, so that you're capturing a little bit of a more dramatic area of luminance, but because it's just that center area, and you might get lucky that there's not as much water blur, and you can mask that in Photoshop.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
Or I might just take one of those single frames into Photoshop and try and mask it in, because then what you get back is you get the water detail on the top, and then it doesn't look like it was a long exposure. But I could tell you that having done this with daylight, I never sent you any of the links, but I've shot for quite a few pool companies, so I have dealt with this issue even in daylight.
Okay.
Shooting HDR at pools is very difficult because of as soon as you get past that one shot, you lose all the ripples.
Well, that's what I was. Yeah, exactly. I have limited experience shooting pools and whatnot, but I would say the same thing. I think they're a challenge. I really, really do think they're a challenge, which is why I wanted to talk about this one.
It's you have to bump up ISO. I think I had my ISO all the way up to 3200.
Oh, well, the D3 can handle it,
It can, and then the other thing that's nice about Enfuse is that you can obviously in Lightroom you can change you can deal with noise with the slider, and then when you're merging, thankfully the noise is different on every frame. So as Enfuse merges, it actually has a different noise blend. So it's choosing the better pixels in each one. Whereas when I was doing this in Photomatix, it was just merging to HDR, and all of the noise was in every single frame. Do you see what I'm saying? So what I had done was I didn't use RAW. I actually put it through, I believe it was Lightroom 1, and I put it through Lightroom 1, and I changed each image, exported out of TIFFs, having tried to tackle the noise in each individual image as best possible, and then I did the merge to HDR.
Excellent stuff. Excellent. Before we go, I just wanted to ask you 2 last questions, and the first one was: do you moving away from real estate and whatnot, but what else do you photograph? Do you do any personal work, weddings, portraits, events, anything? Yeah?
I've done all. I've done a few weddings. It's not my style. It's not my speed. I like to take my time. I like to, and weddings are just too fast for me. To be honest. And the other thing is that I had equipment for both, and it was just overwhelming. I don't have to tell you the amount of money you have to spend to have, full kit to be a wedding photographer, full kit to be real estate photographer. It's just, it's out of control.
They're different games.
They're different. So I basically dropped weddings and beach portraits for the most part. I still do get occasional quotes. Realtors generally will say, "Oh, do you do portraits?" And I'm like, "Well, sure, we'll do it. I'll do one for you." So I still I still do some headshots, but you have to understand I shoot in properties all week long. So I don't have a studio. So it doesn't make any sense to try and do portraits, but I do portraits. I've tested gear on girls that say they want to, get started in modeling and everything else. I mean, nothing seedy, just stuff that I'm like, oh, cool, I have this new flash, I have this new lens, I have this new camera. I'd really like to test it out, and I don't want to actually do it on a commercial shoot. So I'll contact somebody who's interested in trying to get a portfolio started for their modeling, and I tell them up front, I'm like, listen, I'm going to experiment a ton, and it might get annoying because I'm going to play with some of the camera settings, but you're going to get some free shots.
There you go.
And that's basically the extent. I do mostly commercial and real estate. In fact, on my website about a month ago, I pulled off the section where I had portraits and models completely, just because I'm really not marketing that, and I just felt it was a distraction. I just got rid of it.
I know exactly what you're saying. Back to the thing that you had just said, I thought that was a great business tip. Super amazing business tip is that let's reframe the conversation. Say you're out on a shoot with a couple of maybe a model who's gonna she's breaking into modeling, and you haven't told her that you're experimenting with gear, and half the time you're fiddling with the camera and the lens and you're not happy. What are they gonna think of you if you haven't been upfront with them? You know what I mean? I think it's a great tip to say, shoot things if you're gonna shoot it for free or something. Say, I have no idea what I'm doing with this equipment, so bear with me.
I've done that with real estate. I actually had, when I got the D3 and the 14 to 24, I was literally salivating. Now, I had been shooting with a 5D and a 16 to 35 and was very happy, but all of a sudden I had this like high ISO beast and a wider lens, and I was so excited, and I had nothing on the books for like a week. So I called up a couple of realtors that I've shot for, and I was like, hey, do you have anything on the Gulf? Do you have anything right there on the beach that, you haven't shot? And they're like, well, I just haven't budgeted for that property or whatever, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. I just want to go out and take like 3 or 4 shots, and I'll give them to you for free. I really want to test the gear. Mm-hmm. So I've done that, and other people have emailed me and say, hey, I'm looking to get started, Mike, in HDR. I'm looking to add it. I'm looking to do real estate photography, but my challenge is that every time I talk to a realtor, they want to see a portfolio, and I don't have any shots.
Right. It's a catch-22 among anybody getting started in any of these fields, by the way.
I know. But, here's the control. I found that the nicer the properties that are on the portfolio, on my, here I am saying it should be on, I haven't updated my site in like a year. It's like after you sent shots to me originally, I was like, oh my God, that's still on there. That's like from like 3 years ago. I'm like, I have to delete that immediately. Oh no. Not the ones that you just showed today, obviously, but some other ones that you had pulled. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that's still on my website.
Oh man.
So anyway, the thing is that, and I just had somebody this last week do this with me. They got in touch with me. They asked me how to get started. And I said, look, you need to go to the top realtors in your area, find out which trophy properties they have, and then just say, look, I will shoot that trophy property for you for free. And maybe you can negotiate better than free, but it's very easy to get someone to say yes when you are not asking for anything. And what it'll do for you is it'll give you practice. You need to tell the realtor right up front that you're new, that maybe you can point them to a site of somebody else that's done this particular type of photography and say, look, this is what I'm trying to do, and this is where I think I'm going to end up. You'll get the shots for free, and I just want them for my portfolio. And what'll end up happening, if nothing else, is you'll learn a tremendous amount on the capture side, on the editing side, and the worst thing that could happen is you end up with some stunning shots to put on a portfolio of a trophy property that you may not get for like a year or so until you've got such a great portfolio put together that someone would even be willing to let you shoot their trophy property.
I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more. Keep the stakes low. Keep your, keep your attention set on learning and networking rather than making money at first, and see where that goes.
It's so hard when you get started. For me, it was different. Like I told you in the early part of the podcast, I mean, I basically was a client, started shooting my own stuff. So I didn't have this, but I've seen other people try and break into it. And what I've seen is the folks that get up and running fastest are the ones that are willing to go out there and do some pro bono work in order to get really good shots on a portfolio. And then very quickly, they stop doing any free shoots.
Hey, that's how it happens. Let's just transfer that to the wedding industry. That happens a lot when people are emerging in the wedding photography sector. What they'll do is they'll say, "I will do your wedding for free or for $500, which is next to free," and they're completely open and they disclose that they're just learning and blah blah blah. And then pretty quickly they book up, and then they say, "I'm not doing any more free shoots, or I'm not doing any more discounted shoots." And I mean, but sometimes it takes that subsidized rate to get your foot in the door.
It's like you said, it's no different. I mean, with graphic designers, websites, everything else. I mean, you could have learned all the techniques, but unless you actually have product on your portfolio to show, nobody's going to write a check.
Right.
Unless they know you.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. From a business aspect, you have to have product that you have done yourself to show in order for someone to feel comfortable to write a check.
Exactly. Last question. It's more of that last advice section. What advice would you give to somebody getting started in real estate photography?
Yeah, well, if you're brand new, what I just talked about obviously is relevant. Gear is something that I don't feel as though if you're just getting started, and I know this is going to rub some people a little differently, but I really feel as though the state of the DSLR market has gotten to the point that you can start with even a Rebel and a quality wide-angle lens, and you can get started and produce very high-quality work because you're taking brackets. If you're going to do HDR, I'm talking about now specifically because the whole conversation has been about HDR. If it's not one shot, then I feel strongly you could start with a Rebel or a lower end DSLR. If you're not going to do the HDR, then you do have a situation where those lower end DSLRs do not have the same dynamic range in one shot as the higher end bodies. But if you're just getting started, I feel very strongly you could get a DSLR, a wide angle lens, and with the captures, you gain back all that dynamic range in the multiple frames. And you can get started from that aspect. But you've got to figure out your post flow. And that it just comes down to you need the portfolio. You need to make sure that you have a flow. And with real estate photography, much different than architectural photography from my experience, I do not advertise myself as an architectural photographer because I do quick turns. There's times where I don't do HDR. It's rare, but there are times where somebody needs a very, very quick shoot. They just need better than their iPhone. Mm-hmm. And you need to be quick. Like some of these shoots that I do, like 15 to 20 shots, I am in and out in under an hour. Because the rental companies, and that's something else, if you're in a vacation destination market, rental companies have been a very good bread and butter for me because they need very good images. And a lot of times rental companies that aren't the Marriotts, et cetera, but truly just people renting out houses, they need good photography. And a lot of times they only have like a 1 or 2 hour window from when the property gets cleaned and when the next guest checks in for you to get in there and shoot. So you need to get very efficient. You need to be very efficient with your camera if you're going to get involved with real estate photography. And the other thing is just simply because of time. If you're not fast, you're going to spend an enormous amount of time on capture and post-processing and never get paid for that extra time. You just need to get efficient.
I love it. I love the efficiency. I think Alan Blakely was the last person that we interviewed, and he gave basically very similar advice. Was efficiency was the underlying point of what he was saying, which was you have to be efficient. Because for me, like for example, it's 1:30 here. I have a shoot at 2:30, and then another shoot right after that. 2 shoots is not too bad, but if you're not efficient about it, you're not able to knock off both of them and still have a life, at night.
Bingo.
Yeah.
And actually, that's actually a very good reason why HDR makes a lot of sense because you don't have to drag in multiple flash units into every single room and stage. And, you can be much quicker with HDR. And that's probably another reason why I'm going to stick with it for at least the foreseeable future.
And you know what else I'm going to say? It looks less impressive. I'm going to be honest. It looks under impressive when I go into a house and I bracket off 7 or 9 frames and I move along. I move very quickly. Sometimes I'll be in a half hour, 40 minutes if it's a smaller house, and they'll look at me like, "What are you doing? Why are you getting paid for this?" But they don't know that I'm going to be sitting behind my computer, basically tweaking all the light that I've just gathered. So I would say don't be embarrassed about the way it looks, on the outside.
Yeah, and I'm very clear with folks too. If they're there for the particular shoot, like if it's not just like, Mike, here's the code and let me know when you're out. If they're there, I let them know. I'm like, look, this is going to be really fast here. I'm like, but it's going to take me hours to put together these multiple frames, hours and hours per image. Like, I'll exaggerate it to a certain extent because I want them to know, look, I'm in and out of here in 40 minutes, but trust me, it's not that easy. So.
But the knowledge and the information that you are putting into that, let's just say it takes 2 or 3 hours in post for a really large shoot. They don't know that you've been working on this workflow for years and years, that it's taken you this long to figure out, and that if they were to do it themselves, it would take them years to figure out.
Yeah, I've had realtors pay me to show them what I do, and let me tell you something. I shoot for them. None of them want to do it once they realize that, oh my God, you have to sit in front of a computer and do all that, click, click, click. Forget that. I'm just going to pay you.
Exactly.
But at least they know. They know the process. So.
Well, Michael, I think we're plumb out of time. Thank you for joining us on the Real Estate Photography Podcast, and I really appreciate your information. I hope our guests like it.
Sounds like I'm about to have a military helicopter go over top. So a good ending to the podcast as a strike is imminent. Yeah, I'm near a military base here. But I do appreciate the podcast. I listen to them. I see the posts, and I appreciate all the effort that you put into them because I know this is a tremendous amount of work on your side, Mike. So thanks for the time.
No problem. Thanks. And I'm going to say goodbye.
All right. Have a good one.